At 7:30 on the morning of the 1st of July, 1916, the whistles blew, and thousands of British soldiers climbed out of their trenches into no man's land. They had been told that the wire would be cut, the German trenches smashed, the enemy stunned into silence by a week of bombardment. Instead, as they moved forward, under the 66 pounds of weight consisting of rifles, ammunition, tools, water, rations, and we can't forget that heavy weight of fear, the German machine guns opened up. Men fell before they'd gone 50 yards. Some fell before they'd even properly left the trench itself. Lines broke apart in the smoke. Officers vanished mid-gesture. Platoons dissolved into shell holes, chalk, screams, and gunfire. And still they went on. Not because they were stupid, not because they were sheep, but because the men beside them were going on, because the whistles had blown, and because discipline, courage, terror, and duty all pushed them into the same killing ground. By nightfall, the British Army had suffered more than 57,000 casualties, and more than 19,000 men were dead on one day, one summer day, precisely 110 years ago, and the Battle of the Somme had barely begun. Welcome back to the Rum Ration Podcast. I'm Colin, and what I was describing there was the first day of the Battle of the Somme, a battle whose 110th anniversary we mark this year, and we're actually recording it on the 1st of July, so it would have kicked off exactly 110 years ago. So happy Canada Day, or I guess it would have been Happy Dominion Day back then, right?
Happy
Rejoy?
Dominion Day. That's right. I'm Rejoy, and that's right, Colin. Happy Dominion Day, and what a day it was on July 1st, 1916. So today we're going to do two things at once, which is, well, always dangerous and therefore very much our brand.
That's right.
We're going to honor the horror of the Somme, because you can't talk about it honestly without facing the slaughter. It's unavoidable. But we're also going to push back against the lazy version of the story, that it was simply a pointless massacre ordered by mustachioed incompetence who had somehow misplaced the concept of machine guns. And you know, Colin, there are actually many lazy, easy versions of this story which do it absolutely no justice whatsoever.
No, you're absolutely right. It's hard to believe how many people's perception of history was shaped by Blackadder, and the whole concept of that. A very funny line about moving the general's tea trolley that 1 yard closer to the Germans' line, and they actually had that. Remember that yard of
Yes,
crap
yes.
that they captured. But the truth, the real truth, is worse. And of course, like all military history truth or any historical truth, it's more complicated and we think much more useful, which in military history is usually just the warning label.
Exactly. Now, the Battle of the Somme is one of the most famous, most misunderstood, and most emotionally loaded battles in modern military history. And your opening there, Colin, kind of really hit home with that, brought the scale of it, the grandeur of it, and what the soldiers must have, a bit of an inkling of what they might have felt. So it began on as you mentioned, the 1st of July, 1916, and it dragged on. You might be hearing my contrarian cat, Newton, who claims that it actually started earlier.
Yeah, right.
He's counting the 6 days.
It was supposed to. To be
was.
fair,
Yeah.
I think he was reading Haig's memoir because it was supposed to have started towards the 25th of June, I think.
He's also referencing the 6 days of bombardment. He counts it as
right,
the beginning of the battle.
course.
Yes. But it dragged on until the 18th of November, 1916. So just try and picture that. 1st of July. Now, if you were one of the troopies that made it through this whole battle, you would have gone into action on the 1st of July, and it would have taped down by the 18th of November. That's that's a hell of a long time.
Those soldiers wouldn't have been in the line the entire
That is true.
time.
That is true.
Rotated in and out, but still.
Quite right. Quite right. You know you're going back into the same battle.
Yeah, you're going back into the same hellhole.
It's not over. So you're talking about nearly 5 months of fighting.
Yeah.
Over 1 million casualties across the British, French, and German armies.
1 million.
1 million casualties in that 5-month period. A battlefield that became shorthand for mud, wire, machine guns, and the industrialized destruction of men. And for many people, the Somme means one thing above all else: that first day, which you described so searingly, Colin. 1st July 1916, the worst day in the history of the British Army. More than 57,000 British casualties in a single day, including over 19,000 killed. Now, that figure is so enormous that it almost stops being a number and becomes a kind of moral injury.
Yeah, and here's the thing. The Somme was not only that first day.
Yeah.
And if we treat it as only the first day, we miss what the battle was actually for, what it became, why it continued for 5 months, and what it did to the German army, and then how it shaped the way the British and Imperial armies fought for the rest of the war.
Yeah.
Because if we just reduce the Somme to futility and leave it there, we're not really understanding it. We're just putting a label on a catastrophe.
Yeah.
The Somme was horrific, there's no
Yes.
question, but it was not random. It was not launched because a few generals fancied moving flags around a map before lunch.
Yeah.
It came out of an Allied strategy, a French desperation. Like the Allies, that's the thing to really understand here. It wasn't just the Brits by themselves. It was the French begging them for help.
Yeah, exactly.
And of course, British inexperience, the British old contemptibles who we've talked about in previous episodes, that professional core of their army had pretty much been killed by this time. There's nothing left.
Disappeared. Yep, disappeared. Yeah, they've got the new army.
And you had industrial level firepower, never experienced before, and a battlefield problem nobody had yet solved.
Yeah, exactly. I think there are a lot of people who like to think that it's 1916 and General Haig and his staff decided, why not launch another offensive? Wasn't the case. Now that what you just said there, that a battlefield problem nobody had yet solved, it's a very First World War sentence, isn't it?
Yeah.
Nobody had solved the battlefield problem, so naturally the solution was to ask several 100,000 men to go and test the problem in person and see how to work this out.
Yeah, and I know we're going to talk about it a little bit, but one of the things that always strikes me is that the war hadn't even been going on for 2 years yet. And kind of like what we're seeing in Ukraine, the pace of technology, the pace of change was unbelievable.
Yes.
I mean, the British soldiers who went over the top were wearing helmets, which was the first major time they've been doing that.
That's right.
And that probably, if they hadn't had those helmets, you think of all the airburst shrapnel, I bet you the casualty figures would have been even higher, which is hard to believe.
Oh, 100%. Yes. The Brodie helmet was designed to counter or to try and provide protection against shell bursts.
Yeah, we do have an episode on that, of course. Folks, go back into our back catalog. I think it's one of our earlier episodes.
It is season 1.
Season 1, yeah. And then, of course, gas warfare. We did a couple of episodes on that. That would have been a big fact of it, too. But yeah. So to understand the Somme, and do you say Somme or do you say Somme?
Somme.
You say Somme?
Yeah, okay. I say Somme.
Oh, fuck you. I'm going to say Somme.
Yeah. Well, sometimes that's correct. Well,
we do need to get out of July 1916 for a moment and go back to the overall strategic situation. Because, as I mentioned, the war had been going on for almost 2 years. But by late 1915, the Western Front had hardened really into a trench system that everybody knows of, and we think of the stereotypical First World War picture, the channel to Switzerland, armies facing each other through mud, wire, dugouts, artillery zones, listening posts, machine gun nests, and the world's grimmest real estate market. That's putting it mildly.
Indeed. A lovely fixer-upper. Needs roof, drainage, and fewer corpses, if you can help that. Yes. But excellent access to enemy artillery.
Unparalleled, it can be said.
That is very true. So the Allies needed a plan for 1916. Now, at the Chantilly conferences, in fact, they agreed to coordinated offensives. So looking at the war in a broader scale. Pressure on the Western Front, pressure by Russia in the east, pressure by Italy, who had now entered the war on the Allied side against Austria-Hungary. So the idea was to stretch the Central Powers so they could not simply shift reserves from one front to another. And the Central Powers, of course, being Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey. The Somme was originally intended as a French-led offensive.
Right.
With the British supporting them, where the British and French armies met in northern France. And that is very, very important to understand. The Somme was not originally Haig's grand personal adventure in Picardy.
That's right.
It was part of a broader Allied plan, and the French were the senior partner in that plan, because one has to also remember, when the Triple Alliance came about, what the French brought to the table was their army.
Yeah, huge,
and arguably more experienced.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And what the British brought to the table was their navy. The Royal Navy was the largest navy in the world, ruled the seven seas. So the army was very much an afterthought.
Correct.
And then Verdun happened.
Ah, yes, that. 21st of February, 1916, so just a couple of months prior, the Germans attacked Verdun.
Yeah.
General Erich von Falkenhayn's idea, which was to bleed the French army white by forcing it to defend ground of immense symbolic importance, which it kind of did.
It did, yeah.
Do you think if the French had just said, "Yeah, fuck it, we don't really need it. It's not that. It's not strategic. It's not strategically important. Have a nice day." Then
all the guns are gone anyway. They had stripped the fort of the guns, so
But that's not what happened, and I think we should probably do an episode on Verdun itself.
I think we should, yes,
because Verdun became a furnace. The French poured men and shells into it, and the Germans did the same. So, as opposed to the Germans thinking they would be bleeding the French white. Well, both sides were getting bled pretty white. Because by the time, by the time the Somme opened, Verdun had been raging for months.
Yes, they shall not pass.
They shall not pass.
That's what the French said,
and all that good stuff.
Exactly. The problem was the French weren't going forward either. So there was, it's a bit of it really was a charnel house.
It was. That's the epitome of an actual killing machine. Like you had whole battalions and brigades of marching up the Voie Sacrée and not returning.
Never coming back. So Verdun changed everything. And by everything, I mean everything. The French role on the Somme suddenly shrank, almost disappeared, because so much of their strength was being consumed at Verdun. The British, who were still building up their mass citizen army, Kitchener's New Army, suddenly had to carry far more of the offensive than originally planned. And that's the crux of the matter right there.
And they had to do it earlier than they'd wanted, and just because we know that our super fan is Jay, and he's American, and you'd pronounce the Chantilly conference. I think we should say, for Jay, Chantilly. He might be able to understand it a little bit. So.
Not Chantilly?
Probably get myself in trouble here, but poor old Haig, who now had the entire Somme offensive dumped on him, would have preferred a little bit more time to prepare for this. I
say what?
That British Army of 1916, as I mentioned earlier, was not the small professional army of 1914, because that was dead, pretty much. And if they weren't dead, the battle-experienced NCOs and officers were pulled off to be instructors and form the nucleus of leadership for all the new PALS battalions and anything else being formed up.
That's right.
So this was making up Kitchener's New Army.
Yeah.
The volunteers who had swarmed the recruiting centers and enlisted in 1914 and 1915 and were now facing their first major continental offensive, and were they ever?
Yeah, and if you look back at a lot of the footage from the time and the documentation, they were very, very enthusiastic volunteers. I mean, they swarmed the colors, and the army just could not deal with the influx at that time. There were so many of them. And so this brings us to the PALS battalions, because we really need to talk about them. They're central to why the Somme hit Britain so deeply. These were, so what are they? Who are the PALS battalions? They were units raised from the same towns, factories, offices, clubs, and neighborhoods. The idea was simple, and at the time, powerfully appealing. Join up with your friends, train together, serve together, fight together. Hence the name, PALS. It was recruitment by community spirit, patriotic, emotional, and brutally effective. Remember, nobody had even imagined the scale of massacre that was happening on the Western Front. This was unprecedented. So it's a perfectly normal way of mobilizing soldiers for the cause.
Yeah, there's been a small inkling of the level of sacrifice. What Christmas 1914, there was a couple million dead already.
But just because the regular army has disappeared, it shouldn't.
But censorship made sure that the British public didn't hear about all those German, Austrian, Turkish, everyone else, Russian casualties that were happening, Serbian. Yeah.
Yes,
But
yes.
the PALS Battalion, great recruiting idea, great, very effective. But on the Somme, that same idea became devastating because when
Yeah.
a PALS Battalion was cut to pieces, the loss didn't scatter across the country. The effect was very focused, and it came home to one place, one town,
Yeah.
one street, one mill or factory, one football club. Men who had marched away together were killed or wounded together, and entire communities were hollowed out in a single morning.
To get I suppose, a small taste of what it could have been like is, do you remember that movie, Once We Were Soldiers and
Oh,
Young?
we were soldiers once and young.
We Were
Yeah,
Soldiers Once and
yeah,
Young.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And when that battalion was,
Mel Gibson was not young in that. In
no, he
that.
was not. No, no. That's that's a different podcast. But that idea of the soldiers' wives getting the notification that their husbands have been killed, and it was in that small little army community. Now, amplify that, multiply it across a town, across small cities. You begin to get an idea of how complete communities were being wiped out.
Well, that's what I always, when I'm asked to, when I get invited to speak about World War One, I try to relay it on the home front, the impact, and I say that the most terrifying object, or the most terrifying thing in the First World War wasn't the machine gun, the airplane, or gas. It was a 13 or 14-year-old boy on a bicycle, coming up your drive to deliver a telegram.
That's right. That's very true. Now, the Accrington Pals are a well-known example. They went forward on the 1st of July, and they were shattered in minutes.
Yeah.
But they weren't alone. You had Sheffield, Leeds, Bradford, Barnsley, Liverpool. Places across Britain had sent their sons in groups, and the Somme returned the cost in the same dreadful pattern.
And that matters, because when we talk about the Somme, we're not just talking about formations on a map. We're talking about a citizen army, new, eager, patriotic, and in many places still painfully inexperienced.
Yes.
Being thrown into the largest British offensive of the war so far. And it's so important to understand when we say inexperienced, like, yeah, these millions rallied to the colors, but there were no uniforms for them. There were no weapons for them. There was no equipment for them. So all that had to be done. Like, all these industries had to change. You had to find places to house them. You had to figure out ways to feed them. You had to figure out ways to train them. You had to figure out how to get them over to France. I mean, it was a huge mobilization.
Yeah, that's right. So not as easy as some would have you think.
No.
Now, myth number one.
Aha.
The Somme was not launched because British commanders woke up one morning and said, well, what if we simply fed young men into machine guns until morale improves? You hear that over and over and over
the
and over
insensitive
again.
generals sitting in their chateaux so far behind the line.
Sipping fine wines and moving pins on maps. No, the Somme was launched because Allied strategy required a major offensive, because the French needed a relief at Verdun, and because the Western Front was where Germany's main army had to be fought.
Yeah, it does. We're not trying to say that makes the planning brilliant, but when you only have limited options and choices, it does make the battle comprehensible. And history that is only moral outrage is not history, although it seems to be very trendy these days.
Oh, very, very trendy, yes. Yes.
But as Rejoy likes to say, it's just shouting at a graveyard.
Which brings us to our first fantasy sponsor break.
Dun, dun, dun.
So before we go further into the artillery plan, this episode is not brought to you by our fantasy sponsor, Chateau Barbed Wire 1916.
A bold red with notes of iron, cordite, and staff optimism.
Pairs beautifully with bully beef, bad maps, and a creeping suspicion that the preliminary bombardment has not, in fact, solved everything.
Chateau Barbed Wire. Uncork carefully. The wire may still be intact.
Available nowhere, and frankly, that's probably for the best.
Yes, I'd say so.
Yes.
The Allied plan depended heavily on artillery. The British began a massive preliminary bombardment on the 24th of June, 1916, lasting 7 days. The guns were expected to destroy German trenches, collapse all the dugouts, cut the barbed wire, silence the German artillery, and generally render the German front line a smoking administrative inconvenience that the advancing British troops would just have to stroll over, stir the ashes with their bayonet, and call it a day.
Exactly. But there's
wait, didn't go that way?
There's always a but. The problem was that the German defenses were better than many British planners had appreciated. They had deep dugouts. They had really deep dugouts.
Really deep.
Really deep. And, the Germans have a reputation for being thorough and exact.
Yes.
And they really brought this expertise to the Western Front. Reinforced positions.
With reinforced concrete, by the way, folks. Not only were they really deep, they were really deep with reinforced concrete.
So not just timber and sandbags, machine gun posts, strong wire. The Germans have been there long enough to make the front line less a trench system and more of I guess you could call it a heavily armed basement conversion,
But you could kind of understand why the British planners, you don't know what you don't know, right?
That's right.
So they're looking at their own trenches. They hadn't been in a German trench. They didn't realize how frickin' deep these things were. And their own trenches, because the French and the British attitude was never to make their trenches too comfortable because they didn't want the troops to become reluctant to attack.
That's true. I mean, they used to say that the Germans had the best trenches.
Yeah, of course.
Then there were the British that were done with professionalism, and then you had the French trenches, which are basically just an
open sewer.
Yeah, because you're not supposed to sit there. We need to kick the Germans out of our country.
That's right.
So don't get comfy.
Right.
Yeah.
But the British, they would look at their trenches, which were 9, maximum 12 feet deep at places. And the dugouts that they did make were not usually authorized. They were kind of temporary. They were dug into the side of a wall, which actually just kind of weakened the overall structure and trench system. Like British trenches and French trenches were freaking dangerous to be in, as opposed to the.
They caved in. They caved in
all the time. So you can understand as a British artillery planner, we're going to pound the shit out of these trenches and there'll be nothing left of them. And if they were shelling British trenches, they were correct. Yeah. So all that to say, not surprisingly, the British bombardment was perhaps not as effective as hoped. Many shells were shrapnel because that's deadly against troops in the open, but doesn't do a hell of a lot against deep dugouts and concrete.
No.
I think they were hoping that was going to help cut the wire, right?
Yes.
The shrapnel. That was using like a flail to cut the barbed wire.
That was the hope. Yeah.
Hope. Many shells, remember that word, folks, hope, because many shells actually failed to explode. The National Army Museum notes that their estimates are as many as 30%. So it's a big number. 30% of the shells fired in that preliminary bombardment failed to even detonate.
Yeah, it's crazy. Crazy.
So therefore, the wire often remained uncut. German machine gun positions survived because they don't leave the machine guns up top during the shelling. They pull them down into their 30-foot concrete reinforced bunkers with them.
That's right.
And dugouts remained intact because, again, they were 30 feet down. And in some places, the bombardment warned the Germans exactly where the attack was coming, as it kind of tends to do. There was also the issue of the mines. Huge underground mines, not mining for gold, but these were big, huge mines where they packed them full of explosives, like hundreds of tons of explosives underneath the German positions, and then they detonated them under the German trenches before the attack. The Hawthorne Ridge mine famously was blown 10 minutes before 0 hour, which made for a spectacular explosion.
Yeah.
Also kind of gave the Germans a helpful warning that the morning was about to get a lot worse.
Yes. This is one of those moments where you can almost hear the German sentry saying, Hans, I don't want to overreact, but I believe there may be an attack.
That big hole? I think there's a reason for it now.
I think they are coming from that direction over there. Do you want to bring up the machine gun?
Yeah, let's cover. I say we cover the hole just for fun. And maybe call in some artillery fire on it.
Yeah, exactly. What could possibly go wrong? So let's explore that first day, which you so describe with such detail and emotion,
eloquence, and dignity.
Yes, that's exactly what it is. Now at 7:30 a.m. on the 1st of July, 1916, the British infantry went over the top, as the saying goes. 14 British divisions attacked.
Yeesh.
14 divisions. Now, the French attacked in the south and did better, partly because they had more experience, better artillery preparation in their sector, and faced a somewhat weaker defense system. That also has to be noted. But on much of the British front, the attack was, well, it was a catastrophe. The image most people have is of men walking slowly across no man's land in neat lines while German machine gunners cut them down. And there is some truth in that image.
Yeah.
But again, we need nuance and we need context. In some sectors, many sectors, in fact, men were heavily loaded with equipment, as you described, Colin, earlier in your opening, 66 pounds upwards of equipment. You're not going to be sprinting with that kind of gear on your back. And you and I both carried a lot of gear, and you know that you're moving at a trot at best.
At best.
And then for short periods.
And you're going over ground that's been shelled for
exactly
7 days. It's probably not smooth like a parade square.
Exactly. So, and in others, they were expected to maintain formation behind a barrage. That's the other thing. In some places, tactical methods varied, and not every unit simply strolled forward nonchalantly. It wasn't, in other words, it wasn't one uniform method of moving forward.
No, because the attack was also, it was spread across multiple kilometers.
Exactly.
Width, right? And you had about 250,000, like you mentioned, 14 British divisions.
That's right.
To the uninitiated, that's, a British division at the time was around 16,000 people. So you've got up to 250,000 British soldiers advancing.
That's right. That's right.
But the fundamental reality remains that many German defenders survived the bombardment, dusted themselves off, climbed out of their dugouts, manned their weapons, cleaned the dirt and grit out of the belts of machine gun
the
bullets,
block,
and then opened fire. And the infantry, the British infantry who were advancing, were exposed in no man's land, laden down like you're talking about. And then now suddenly they're exposed by German rifles, artillery, and machine guns. And the result was slaughter.
Yeah.
The British National Army Museum includes the first-person account of a Lieutenant Alfred Bundy. Al Bundy? Really?
Oh, yes. Right.
Rejoy.
No wonder he was so jaundiced about everything. Oh.
So good old Al Bundy of the 2nd Middlesex Regiment of the 8th Division, who wrote of the attack, quote, "The din was deafening, the fumes choking. It was a veritable inferno," end quote. He then described sudden rifle and machine gun fire, men falling, and bullets forming what he called an impenetrable barrage. We'll have a little bit more on that later.
Yeah, that phrase, impenetrable barrage, is chilling because it captures what the soldiers were up against. Not dramatic movie bullets whipping past heroically, but a physical wall of metal. It kind of reminds me of the episode we did on Vimy, where we talked about the soldiers hunching over.
Yeah, that's right.
Against
the Royal Newfoundland Regiment, who was wiped out on the first day of the Somme, that's described in their official history, how they kind of hunched their shoulders and put their collars up as if they were going into a storm. Like,
that's right. Lord. That's right. And this is why that first day is so important and matters so much. It was the collision between old assumptions and modern defensive firepower, played out across thousands of yards of open ground.
Yeah, by the end of the day, the British Army had suffered 57,470 casualties, of which 19,240 were killed. The attack had failed across much of the front, but we should be clear about something here. The first day of the Somme was catastrophic, but it was not one uniform wall of failure from end to end. As I said, it was covered across multiple kilometers in width.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But just to go back to those figures, one day, today, 110 years ago, today, that's what happened. But you're quite right. It was not one uniform wall of failure from end to end by any means. Because the familiar version of the story that's told about the Battle of the Somme can make it sound as if every British unit simply walked forward and was wiped out in exactly the same way. I mean, there's that anecdote about the officer who went into action, kicking a football.
Yeah, and I think he came back from leave and brought back a football for each company.
Yeah,
they were going to kick it over, and they put a contest in place.
Yeah, exactly. So, that, and again, taken out of context, it can sort of make for a searing image.
Hmm.
But the thing is, it's all of this is not exactly true. You know, um, in the southern part, for example, the southern part of the British line, where the British were closer to the French, the
Hmm.
artillery support was stronger, preparation was better, and the German defenses were hit harder. There, the attack had real success.
Yeah, the 30th and the 18th Divisions, for example, they took their objectives around Montauban.
Yeah.
The 7th Division captured Mametz, and further north, I should say, the 36th Ulster Division made a remarkable advance at Thiepval, and they took the Schwaben Redoubt.
Yeah, but the pattern of the day was cruel. Successes on one part of the line were often isolated by failure elsewhere. So the Ulstermen at Schwaben Redoubt, for example, had gone forward brilliantly, but their flanks were exposed.
Mm-hmm.
They advanced into the German position, but the neighboring attacks had not kept pace. Now, that's also an interesting point. I'm not saying the neighboring attacks had failed. They had not kept pace.
Right.
So you've outpaced your supporting elements. Um, so the Germans could counterattack, shell the approaches, and rake the position from the sides because you're
Which,
essentially exposed.
yeah, and it gives us one of the brutal truths of the Somme. Taking ground was only half the problem.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Then you got to hold it. Then you got to reinforce it. Then you got to supply it. And then you got to link up and connect to the units on each side, your flanks. And that was where success could still turn into disaster. And you're talking about the 36th Ulster Division and Thiepval. If you ever get a chance, anyone who's listening, go visit the Thiepval Monument to the British war dead. It's actually just to the missing. It is massive brick structure and has 77,000 names on it. 77,000, and that's just the missing.
That's crazy.
Just the missing from just the Battle of the Somme. It's
Shocking.
staggering. Yeah.
Shocking. So when we say the first day was a catastrophe, we're not saying every battalion failed.
Right.
Or every plan collapsed in the same way. We're saying that the offensive as a whole failed to produce the breakthrough it promised. Now, that's what they always talked about, the breakthrough offensive. We're going to break through and then have the cavalry sweep up the flanks and roll the Germans back into Germany. And the thing, though, was the price paid for those local successes was almost beyond comprehension. As you said, Thiepval, 77,000 missing.
Just a missing. Yeah. We can't escape the fact that some units were virtually annihilated. Towns and communities back home would feel the losses with brutal concentration because of the PALS battalions that we'd mentioned earlier. And they present the best example of the cost. Remember, the PALS battalions were made up of men who had joined together from the same communities.
Indeed. Like I mentioned earlier on, the Accrington Pals in particular. So let's talk about the Accrington Pals a little bit. Officially, they were the 11th Battalion, East Lancashire Regiment. So that gives an identity to who they were, broader than their little town. Men from Accrington and nearby Lancashire towns who had joined together, trained together, gone to war together. The morning of 1st of July, 1916, today, 110 years ago, they attacked near Serres, at the northern end of the Somme battlefield. Around 700 men went forward. Within about half an hour, 585 of them were casualties. Hundreds killed, wounded, or missing before many of them had even reached the German wire. Just to give a little bit of context for any serving members who may be listening to our podcast, and hopefully every single one who is serving is listening to our podcast. Just think about when you're on the parade square, and look around you. There's nobody there.
Yeah.
Gives you a little tiny inkling of what was going on. So that's one of the reasons the Somme is seared into British memory. It was not an anonymous mass loss. It was local loss. I mean, there were faces, names. Everybody knew somebody. Streets, factories, football clubs, church groups, workplaces, all hit at once. You mentioned the telegrams earlier, Colin. The telegrams did not spread evenly. They arrived like a shell burst in their own right.
It's incredible. And because we have our Canadian bias here, it's important to point out that all the Canadians eventually ended up fighting the Somme, but no Canadian infantry units fought in the opening attack on July 1st. But
Yeah.
the 1st Newfoundland Regiment, and Newfoundland, of course, at the time was its own colony. It wasn't part of Canada.
That's right.
It was then serving with a British division, and coming off the fun times that they've been having at Gallipoli, they got
Yes.
to attack at Beaumont-Hamel as part of the Somme offensive.
Yes, and Beaumont-Hamel deserves its own silence. The Newfoundlanders advanced over very open ground under German machine gun fire and were shattered in less than half an hour. The Canadian War Museum records 324 killed and 386 wounded out of 801 men. That is an 89% casualty rate in half an hour.
Yeah, it's important to understand that, as I said, Newfoundland wasn't yet part of Canada, but for Canadians today, it sits firmly inside the wider national memory of the Somme.
It
The
does.
Caribou Memorial at Beaumont-Hamel is one of the most moving of all of them that I've ever seen on the Western Front, all the memorials. And one of the reasons they had such high casualty rates, you said they were advancing over open ground, is because when they were trying to advance, they were moving up communication trenches, and the communication trenches were completely clogged with dead and dying men already. And so the Newfoundlanders, not wanting to miss their objective and wanting to complete fulfill their orders, got out of the trenches and started advancing
Over
in
open
the
ground.
open. And just the results were unbelievable. And Newfoundland, it's got a small population now, and you can say that the economic and social impact still continues to today
Yeah,
from the 1st of July, 1916.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with you on that. So this is also a reminder that the first day of the Somme was not only a British story, it was an imperial story. You had Newfoundland, Britain, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Australia, South Africa, India, the West Indies, and later Canada. The Somme pulled in the empire and gave many of its communities their own July 1st.
Dude, you forgot Australia. No, you didn't.
No,
You forgot New Zealand. New Zealand.
New Zealand. I apologize. New Zealand as well.
They had a hard
course.
time there too.
They did.
But before we move past the opening day, we should deal directly with some of the myths.
Yeah. Myth 1. The Somme had no purpose. It did.
Yeah.
It had a purpose.
Yeah.
It was intended to relieve Verdun, damage the German army, and support a wider Allied strategy of simultaneous pressure. That does not mean the plan worked as hoped. But, quote, failed to achieve a clean breakthrough, unquote, is not the same as had no purpose.
Yeah, that's great. And myth number 2, that the generals didn't know machine guns existed or what the impact would be. Of course they knew. They'd seen what modern firepower could do. The problem was not ignorance of machine guns. The problem was that no army had yet solved the operational problem of breaking through deep trench systems, artillery zones, wire, fortified villages, and reserves on the Western Front.
Yeah.
Myth number 3 would be that the Somme achieved nothing. And this is the hardest, because the human cost was appalling, and the territorial gains were, at best, limited.
Yeah.
The British advanced at most around 7 miles by the end of the battle. That's 11 kilometers?
11 kilometers or so.
Yeah, not exactly Napoleon crossing the Alps. But the Somme did damage the German army. It cannot be argued that it did not. It did force Germany into an attritional struggle on a scale that it could not easily sustain, because we can't forget that the Germans were fighting on 2 fronts. They were also still fighting the Russians at the same time. So
Yes, right.
to be able to lose hundreds of thousands of men at one time was not good for them.
Yeah.
The Imperial War Museum, as part of the sources, point out that the German leadership later sought to avoid another Somme-style battle, with Hindenburg and Ludendorff drawing lessons from the experience of the Somme.
Yeah, that's right. And if you'll note that the Germans never launched a large-scale offensive again until March 1918.
Correct.
So they drew their lessons accordingly. And the British Army also learned, painfully,
Yeah.
expensively, obscenely, but it learned bite and hold tactics, better artillery infantry coordination, night movement, more limited objectives, counter battery work, where I think General Andy McNaughton, the future General Andy McNaughton, learned his work right there, counter battery work.
Sound ranging, for counter battery fire.
Creeping barrages, small unit initiative, tanks, not successfully at first, but introduced for the first time. The Somme was not a triumph, but it was part of the terrible education that led to the British Army of 1918, which was a completely different beast altogether.
Yeah, really good points there, Rejoy, because, we've done a couple of episodes on Vimy Ridge and Hill 70, which were a year later, not even a year later for Vimy. And, it was the rolling barrage and the creeping barrage and the coordination and working
Yep.
as small units, like at
Yep.
platoon size, and the little bite and hold, all of that they learned at the Somme came in to be very, very effective.
Yeah, absolutely.
All this brings us to our second fantasy sponsor, because this episode of the Rum Ration Podcast is most definitely not brought to you by Bite and Hold Bourbon.
The only bourbon designed for the cautious infantryman. You take one sip, consolidate your position, wait for artillery support, and absolutely do not pursue the bottle beyond your planned objective.
Of course not. Bite and Hold Bourbon, because sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is stop after 2 fingers.
Each bottle comes with a miniature trench map, a whistle you should not blow, and a cavalry officer in the background asking if now might be the moment for a dramatic breakthrough. Bite and Hold Bourbon. Advance responsibly.
That's a tough sell. I'm not sure. I know too many infanteers who would stop after just 2 fingers of bourbon.
No, I don't know any actually.
No, I haven't met one yet. The first day was disastrous, but the battle did not end. And this is difficult for modern audiences to accept, because you look at the 1st of July and the 57,000 casualties, 19,000 dead, and that's just the British, not including the French, not including the Germans. Exactly. And you think, surely, okay, after that, they stopped, right? They must have put a white flag up and just cleared the fields for the next 3 days, just trying to pull the casualties off and bury the dead. And
they did not stop. They did not stop.
No. And the reason is ugly, but it's clear. Verdun was still going.
That's right.
The French still needed pressure relief. The Allied strategy still required Germany to be attacked. And the British had already committed themselves to a massive offensive.
Yeah. So between the 3rd and 13th of July, further attacks caused another 25,000 casualties. But British tactics began to adjust. On 14th July at Bazentin Ridge and Longueval, the British used a shorter, more concentrated bombardment and a dawn attack, achieving surprise and making real gains. It was still a bloodbath, but a bloodbath with results. And it does show that the British Army was not simply repeating the 1st of July like a man walking into the same door because he admired the craftsmanship. The Army was experimenting, learning, and adapting. And you know what really strikes me? Learning fast. Because remember,
absolutely.
It was 1st of July was that catastrophic day, and already 2 or 3 days later, they're beginning to adapt and learn.
Well, just a dawn attack versus 7 o'clock in the morning. I still can't understand why 7 o'clock in the morning. It would have been daylight at like 4:30 at that time. Because the northern latitudes in France. But. Yeah. So this is where the Somme becomes important beyond the casualty figures. It's a battlefield laboratory, which is, it's a horrible phrase, because laboratories normally have safety goggles and a lot fewer dead horses. But that's what it was. The Western Front forced armies to solve problems nobody had solved before. How to move infantry under artillery fire, how to communicate once telephone lines were cut, how to identify enemy batteries, how to coordinate artillery with the infantry, how to hold captured ground against counterattack, and how to do all of that while everyone involved was exhausted, terrified, half deaf, and standing in a trench full of things that no trench should contain.
No. That's an interesting point you brought up, half deaf, because one forgets all of that. With all this stuff raging around, I mean, you've got, the din of battle is something ferocious. So, who fought at the Somme? On the Allied side, it was mainly the British Empire and France. The French fought south of the river, and particularly early on, often performed better tactically than the British, it must be said. They had more experience in large-scale continental operations, and in their sector, better artillery density.
British Expeditionary Force included regulars, territorials, which are reservists, Kitchener Volunteers, which was the new army, including the PALS battalions you're talking about. But it also included formations from across the empire, the Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans. Yeah, just because my brother-in-law Steve's in town, so he's probably listening. Hopefully he's listening, and he's a Kiwi. So you had Indians, West Indians, Newfoundlanders, and Canadians. The Canadians did not join the main Somme fighting until later in the battle, but when they did, wasn't fun. They entered one of the hardest schools of war imaginable.
It's interesting that earlier point to how the French seem to be better prepared for this battle. In some ways, is a bit of a throwback to the Crimean War, when in 1854, the French army was arguably better equipped and more experienced than the British army, which was still a bit Napoleonic in many ways.
Yes.
The French at that time actually had an ambulance service. And the Brits, well, the ambulance service was the guy next to you who would hopefully pick you up and bring you back. So anyway, now on the other side stood the German army, dug into powerful defensive positions, as we talked about earlier on. Dug into powerful defensive positions. And it is important not to treat the Germans as passive targets. They were skilled, as they'd already proven, disciplined, as we know, adaptive, and again, deeply entrenched, like very deeply entrenched, literally and institutionally.
Yeah, we keep harping on the deeply entrenched, but I think it's so important for people to understand that it wasn't just a tactical necessity, it was a strategic necessity for the Germans. While the British and the French were approaching, their whole approach was to push the Germans out as fast as possible, so they didn't want to get too comfortable in the trenches. They want to be able to go on the attack, go on the attack, go on the attack. Well, the Germans were fighting a two-front war, and they had to keep one front in a static position, defensive, holding the ground, using the minimum amount of troops possible while they could concentrate and pull off the rest of those troops and fight a mobile, tactical war on the Eastern Front. So the Germans weren't just like, oh, let's wait it out. They took the defense to the nth level in terms of planning and putting out belts of wire and interlocked in fields of fire. Like, it wasn't just like a casual defensive position. It was well deep. Yeah.
And it had to be because in the Eastern Front, they were fighting the Russians,
right,
where they were enjoying quite a level of success against.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they also had to have reserves available to fish the Austro-Hungarians out of the trouble they were getting themselves into because they were being hammered by the Russians. So it was always the Germans going in to save their asses. So
and let's not forget that the Italian front had kind of kicked open too, and
that had kicked open as well.
And your erstwhile ally is fucking that one up. So suddenly you got to pull down German troops to help out there too.
I think at one point I think it was Ludendorff said something about being this alliance between Germany and Austria-Hungary was like being shackled to a corpse.
Yes. I've heard that. Yeah, absolutely.
You can well understand that.
Rommel, the subject of one of your earlier episodes, he fought in the Italian campaign. But we're getting way off track here. So,
as always,
back to the Somme. The Somme was not just brave men versus faceless machine guns. It was an army against an army. The German soldiers suffered horribly too. We keep talking about how deep their bunkers were and how well reinforced they were, but it was no fucking picnic. No. They endured the bombardments. What was it? They called it drum fire?
Drum fire.
It was nonstop artillery bomb.
Yeah.
Nonstop. 7 days of relentless. I mean, they couldn't get their food supplies up.
Yeah.
They couldn't get water up. You couldn't leave your bunker to use the toilet. You had to go poo-poo and pee-pee inside your bunker, and the whole time it was dust falling down and the noxious smoke and everything. It was horrible.
Trommelfeuer.
And then they had assaults and the counterattacks, because that was a German tactical and operational doctrine. As soon as they got attacked, you had to counterattack.
That's right. And, we are talking about these deep dugouts and how well reinforced they are and safe, but if you're a soldier there, you don't know that.
No.
You know it's been built. You don't know if it's going to collapse or not. They're claustrophobic. The ground is shaking. It could, they do still collapse at times.
Oh, yeah.
Not as, often.
Just not as quickly as the British.
But there are many cases of young German soldiers going mad under that pounding. They just could not take it.
Well, not to forget your good friend Hans. I think you made up a fictional Hans as a character as a sentry earlier on in the episode. They had sentries out. So even though there's 24-hour bombardment coming down, you still had to have sentries.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Tap on the shoulder. Your turn, Hans. Up you go. Fuck. Yeah. Grinding pressure of being forced to hold ground under relentless fire.
Yeah, that's right. So one German account, often repeated in the histories of the First Day, describes machine gunners firing for so long that their fingers were left torn by the work.
God damn.
That's not a cinematic detail. That happened. That's not what the movies show.
No.
But this is an example of what happens when industrial warfare meets human bodies.
Yeah. And by September, the battle had entered a new phase. So on the 15th of September, 1916, the Allies launched the Battle of Courcelette.
Yeah.
And Courcelette is a very famous name in Canadian history. And it was significant for two reasons. First, it marked the first use of tanks in battle.
Yes.
And second, as far as we're concerned, much more importantly, it brought the Canadian Corps into the Somme in a major way.
Drum roll, please.
Dum-ba-da-dum.
So the tanks were new, slow, mechanically unreliable.
Kind of like me. Not so new, though. I'm more old.
And deployed before the technology was truly ready. Where have we heard that before? Yeah. Time for an update, I think. The Imperial War Museum notes that only a limited number reached their start lines.
Oops.
It's like, we haven't even crossed the line into the line of battle. We're just getting to where it kicks off. And by the end of the day, there were essentially none left available for immediate exploitation. So can you imagine, like, there you are and your CO comes over and says, okay, boys, guess what? We've got the tanks as support. They're just coming up now. And then, maybe 3 make it up there out of the 20 that were tasked. And as you kick off, those 3 kind of don't make it past the start line, or 1 does, and that gets knocked out.
Yeah, crazy. But come on, psychologically, they were very important.
That they were, yes.
German soldiers had never seen anything like them. What is it? Steampunk? Is that
steampunk?
Fantasy thing?
Yes.
Imagine sitting in a trench in 1916 and genuine steampunk is happening. Seeing a metal box, massive metal box, grinding towards you and grinding over wire and shell holes that had been stopping everyone else before.
Scheiße.
Yeah, it wasn't exactly blitzkrieg, but it was more like a boiler having a nervous breakdown. But it is new, and they were big. They were huge.
They were huge.
They were meant to be so long that they could go right across the
trenches,
trenches and following could continue. So
it
was new, and new things on battlefield are rarely comforting if you're if you're
on the receiving end.
You're on the receiving end. Yeah. Go back to our earlier episodes about gas warfare.
Exactly.
The first time, the Second Battle of Ypres, and watching that gas cloud go, hey, what the fuck is that?
Yes. So fictional Hans's friend is telling him, just shoot it. Just shoot it. And Hans says, yes, exactly. I'm shooting it. It's still coming. Now, as for the Canadians, they were assigned to take the area around the village of Courcelette, as you mentioned. The Canadian War Museum describes the attack as carefully prepared, supported by artillery and tanks, and successful in capturing the ruined village on 15 September, one of the few clear Allied victories on the Somme.
Right. But victory, as always, particularly at the Somme, came at a tremendous cost.
Yeah.
Courcelette was not a clean advance to a cheering village. Let's not get that underway. It was street fighting in ruins. German counterattacks, shortages of ammunition, food and water, and men clinging to a shell-torn ground while the enemy tried to take it back with relentless counterattack after counterattack after counterattack.
Yeah, this is not a Netflix
new
episode. Courcelette was important, but it wasn't Vimy.
Yeah.
It didn't become the national myth in the same way. But for the Canadian Corps, it was a hard and formative battle. The Somme battles cost the Canadian Corps 24,029 casualties.
Damn.
The Canadian War, it's huge. The Canadian War Museum is blunt. From that bloodletting, the Canadians learned the need to improve infantry and artillery tactics and better coordinate the arms of battle.
Yeah, that lesson matters because the Canadian Corps of 1917 and 1918 had Vimy, Hill 70, Amiens, Passchendaele, Canal du Nord. It did not emerge fully formed from maple syrup and stern expressions. You're having fun writing this one, weren't you? It was built through
Canada Day had to throw that in.
I tell you, it was built through these experiences. The Somme was one of these places where the Corps learned what modern battle demanded. We've already covered Vimy and Hill 70s in episodes 10 and 22, respectively. And if you haven't listened to them yet, I highly encourage you to do so because we also liberally sprinkle a lot of RMR references into them. And they give you a very good idea of how the Canadians approached those battles based on their learnings.
Yeah, exactly. And speaking of the armor, it's that time to bring them in. And as always, no episode would be complete without us mentioning our beloved regiment. Now, the Armagh story places the Somme directly into the Canadian experience. We've already covered in earlier episodes how the Armagh, or also known as the 14th Battalion CEF, had been raised in September 1914, had sailed for Britain later that month, and landed in France in February 1915. And it fought as part of the 3rd Infantry Brigade, 1st Canadian Division, for the rest of the war. Now, we've talked about that in past episodes.
We have, and they were part of a brigade, 3rd Brigade, which all the other units were Highland, and there'd been a talk of trying to convert the Armagh to a Highland unit, but we were very lucky to say that we were the only battalion in the 3rd Brigade that managed to serve the entire time in the First World War and keep our pants on.
Keep our pants on. I knew it. Saw where that was going. Yes.
So by the time of the Battle of the Somme, the 14th Battalion Armagh was not green in the same way many British new Army battalions have been on the 1st of July. No, quite the opposite. The Armagh had been reconstituted a couple of times. Because just prior to this, don't forget, in June, middle of June 1916, you had the Battle of Mount Sorel, where the Armagh had its worst day ever. 116 killed on one morning, one attack.
Yes.
So the Canadians had already seen some really hard fighting at places like Ypres, Festubert, and Mount Sorel. But the Somme, it was its own beast.
Yeah, that was something altogether. The Armagh's official history records that in early September 1916, as the battalion prepared for the Somme, the Armagh faced heavy artillery during a 2-day operation, suffered around 200 casualties. That's just before.
And that's as they prepared.
As they prepared. Exactly. Prepared. It's crazy. Then later in September, the battalion was sent into the village of Courcelette as part of the wider offensive. Now, according to the museum account, they fought for 40 hours straight, facing German counterattacks and sustained machine gun fire. As you said, Colin, German doctrine was immediately counterattack. Right. So, and that's what they did. Courcelette had shown the Canadian Corps at its best, though. Aggressive, disciplined, and effective. Regina Trench showed the other side of the Somme. The part where courage and skill still met wire, mud, machine guns, and exhaustion.
Yeah, let's talk about it, Regina Trench, which has a lovely official sound to it. Something, named by a man with clean boots and a clipboard, thinking he's clever. Thinking he's clever, putting down little Canadian, iconic Canadian names of towns to put all the phase lines and all the trenches. He had a clipboard and looked very, very pleased with himself. But in Canadian memory, it became something completely different. It became the ditch of evil memory. Yeah,
and that's not melodrama, is it? No. Regina Trench was one of the strongest German positions facing the Canadians. Long, deep, wired. When we say wired, it's not just a little bit of wire. I mean, you can belts and belts and belts of wire. There's a lot of footage of that. If you can just go and Google it and you'll see.
It could be upwards of 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 feet deep of wire, like interlocking.
Yeah. And that's barbed wire, the precursor to our razor wire of today. So you can imagine. And this was placed just over the crest of the ridge, which meant you often couldn't properly see it until you were already committed to attacking it.
Yeah. And finding out that your artillery had not cut the wire.
Cut the wire. A trench system designed by people who had given serious thought to ruining your morning.
Yes. Yeah. And for the Royal Montreal Regiment, the road to Regina ran through Kenora Trench, another Canadian town. Yes. On the 26th of September, during the Battle of Thiepval Ridge, the battalion was ordered to attack northward. First Sudbury Trench, then Kenora Trench, and then any German positions beyond it. Regina was the larger prize ahead, but Kenora was the immediate problem.
Yeah, that's a very good word for it. At 12:35 p.m., the attack went in. And at first it worked. The Armagh took its first objective quickly, and by mid-afternoon, Lieutenant W.J. Holliday reported that the final objective had been reached. But there's a particular kind of horror in taking your objective and then realizing, well, you may have taken it alone.
Yeah, you mentioned before about being hung, the first day of the Somme and divisions being hung out to dry because their flanks were exposed.
Exactly. So here we have it again. And in relation to Holiday, Colin, I saw you had an interesting observation about him that, well, he was later killed at Vimy serving as a company commander, and that
Correct.
he had been a former professional hockey player.
That's right. In the precursor to the NHL, he played for a Quebec City team and was very famous. And he'd also served in the Boer War. So he was no kid. He was probably in his mid 30s, I'd say 34, 35. And he led the advance company on the first day of the Battle of Vimy Ridge, and later died from his wounds suffered that day. But the units on either side on the attack that the RMR was doing, that Lieutenant Holiday was part of, they had been checked, which meant that both flanks of the RMR were hanging in the air. Whoops. They were in Kenora Trench, but the Germans still held ground to the left and to the right.
Yeah.
So, and the Germans now knew where they were.
Yes.
And so the battalion was now being hit, not just from the front, but from the sides. Enfilade fire, which is the terror of all infanteers. He had bombing attacks down the trench, artillery coming in, machine guns working the length of the position, which is one of those phrases, flanks in the air, that doesn't really convey the reality of what's happening on the ground. You're stuck, you're cornered, you can't move, and you're just getting hit from all sides.
No, it's a very sanitary way of describing what's actually happening. The regimental history describes the men crouching behind whatever parapet existed, then getting up when they had to throw back German bombers trying to rush the flanks. So imagine that. No clean line, no neat front, just a smashed trench, men short of water, wounded being dragged back where possible, bombs coming in from both sides, and, of course, the ever-present machine gun fire sweeping along the position.
By 3 a.m. on the 27th of September, 2/3 of the Kenora garrison had fallen. Whew. Holiday was the only officer still alive and unwounded. He made the decision to withdraw to a reserve trench, not as a collapse, not as a retreat, but to avoid having the whole position wiped out or captured. And then came the kind of order that makes you stare at the page for a moment. Holiday was told to retake Kenora. So he gathered what he could, 17 men. That's right. That's all that's left of the company. 17, and he went forward with them again.
There's something almost absurd about it, except that it actually happened. 17 men advancing to retake a trench on the Somme. The regimental history even pauses over it, wondering what the Germans made of the sight. Perhaps they thought the water tins the Canadians were carrying contained some new Canadian horror. 17 men. Which, given the Canadian Corps' later reputation, was not the worst guess, actually.
We may have inspired some positive parts of the Geneva Convention.
Yes. Hans, they're coming again. Some of the Germans actually ran. Some surrendered. And you know what? Kenora was retaken.
Yeah.
For a while.
A crazy order, but they made it happen.
Yeah.
Because at the Somme, the enemy, they didn't give ground away politely. Later that day, the Germans attacked yet again, bombing in from one side and massing roughly 200 men on the other. Holiday and now Lieutenant Tupper of the 16th Battalion, one of the sister battalions from the 3rd Brigade, they judged the position impossible and withdrew again. So then at 2 a.m. on the 28th of September, after nearly 40 hours of continuous fighting, the order came to attack Kenora for a third time. And I hope you can hear the hammering, because it's just, that's the condo construction next door. That's I asked them to work on Canada Day so that we could have the effect here of the constant hammering that was going against the soldiers. It's just a metaphorical approach here.
It works very well. I feel like I'm almost there myself. And I'm being yelled at by Newton, my contrarian cat, so I'm getting the order to take Kenora Trench one more time. God damn it.
Third time. Jesus Christ.
And the shell fire is drumming away. But back to this incredible story.
Third attack, they're being ordered.
Third attack. And of course, the men are absolutely exhausted. The ground around Kenora was lit by flares. There was no chance of surprise. As they moved forward, the Germans dropped artillery and machine gun fire between the Canadians and the trench. Fire from both flanks hit them again. By 2:30, Holiday saw that the supporting attacks had not come up again, and that if he pushed through the barrage, he would have too few men left to deal with whatever was waiting in the trench. So he called it off and brought the survivors back.
Well, that's the RMR Somme in miniature. Attack, take ground, get isolated, get bombed out, retake it with almost nobody, get pushed out again, attack again in the dark, and then be told by arithmetic that what courage, can no longer solve.
Yeah.
And the early morning of 28 September, out of 445 men, only 75 answered the roll call. Battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Clark, later wrote in his report, quote, "I deeply regret to report the death in action." And then the names begin. Officers killed, officers dead of wounds, officers missing, officers wounded. And then comes the much larger number, the 360 non-commissioned officers and men killed, wounded, or missing in that operation. And Regina Trench, remember it? It's still waiting.
So on 8th October, the 13th Battalion, the Royal Highlanders of Canada, and the 16th Battalion, the Canadian Scottish, assaulted Regina Trench. The RMR, badly reduced by Kenora, was not the main assault battalion. It was in support, in sugar and cable trenches, sending carrying parties and standing ready to reinforce, which sounds safer until you remember, well, this is the Somme, where support often meant carrying ammunition, water, bombs, stretchers, and sometimes pieces of, other people through shellfire to men who were already being destroyed.
Yeah, you're in support, but you're actually fully exposed.
That's right.
Surprise, surprise. Spoiler alert, that attack failed. The Highlanders hit uncut wire. The artillery had not done its job, and they suffered terribly. The Canadian Scottish got into Regina on part of the front, but failures on the flanks forced a withdrawal. The RMR waited in close support, but even the order for it to take over the brigade frontage was cancelled when its depleted strength became clear. What we said, 75 were left?
Yes, 75 were left.
By the time the regiment's part in the Somme was over, it no longer looked like a battalion. The regimental history said that in a little over a month, around 600 men had fallen, and on parade the 14th looked more like a depleted company than the Royal Montreal Regiment that had gone into the fight.
And the bitterest part? The first 3 Canadian divisions were relieved before Regina Trench was fully taken. The, quote, ditch of evil memory, unquote, remained ahead of them. It would fall only later in stages to the newly arrived 4th Canadian Division.
So when we talk about the RMR and Regina Trench, we're really talking about the cruel geometry of the Somme.
Yeah.
The objective was there, visible, named, assigned. But between the map and the trench were wire, mud, machine guns, failed flanks, bad information, and men being reduced to numbers in a report.
Yeah. And that is why this belongs in this episode. Not because Regina Trench gives us a clean, heroic set piece, but because it gives us the Somme as the men experienced it. Close, confused, exhausting, brave, bitter, and usually unfinished. I mean, it gives you a real sense of what it was like.
Yeah, and we haven't really mentioned gas that much, but there would have been some gas being used.
There would have been some gas.
It wasn't even considered that remarkable at the time. It was just another part of daily life, just to help you include the suck. Yeah. But this is where regimental history comes in. National histories give us campaigns, commanders, and casualty totals. Regimental histories give us the human scale. They remind us that the Canadians suffered 24,029 casualties. Well, that's made up of thousands of smaller scenes. A platoon without a sergeant, a company without its old hands, a battalion clerk trying to make some paperwork out of disaster.
And the RMR's connection to the Somme also gives us a through line. This is the same broad Canadian learning curve we talked about earlier. Hard fighting, terrible losses, tactical adaptation, and an emerging reputation for effectiveness. But nobody should mistake effectiveness for immunity. The Canadians earned their reputation by paying for it. And at the Somme, the bill came due.
Rough stuff, but this is time for our final imaginary sponsor, No Man's Land Navy Strength Gin.
Distilled in small batches, then left exposed for 7 days under preliminary bombardment.
Botanicals include juniper, chalk dust, damp wool, and the faint institutional taste of a staff officer saying, "The wire's cut," when the wire has absolutely not been cut.
No man's land Navy strength gin, best served with tonic, lime, and a realistic appreciation of German dugouts.
Do not consume before going over the top, though frankly it might help, and many did.
Yes, many did.
So why does the Somme occupy such a massive place in military history? The first answer is obvious. It's the casualties.
Yeah.
The first day alone was unprecedented for the British Army. The whole campaign produced casualties on a scale that still shocks the conscience.
Yeah, but casualty figures alone don't explain memory. Many battles were bloody. The Somme became symbolic. It symbolized the volunteer army that was destroyed. I think that is one of the major points of it, It symbolized industrial warfare. It was the dawning of a new age. It symbolized the gap between patriotic expectation and battlefield reality. It symbolized modernity turning on the men who had marched into it.
Yeah, speaking of modernity, the Somme was also filmed.
Yeah.
The 1916 documentary, The Battle of the Somme, brought images of the front to millions of people in Britain. And so for many civilians, it was the first time they saw anything resembling the reality of the Western Front.
And that is so incredibly important. Memory isn't only what happened, it's how people first saw it, talked about it,
their perception.
their perception of it. That's everything. The Somme entered British public consciousness almost immediately. Later, after the war, it became part of the larger critique of the generals, the war, and the society that had sent men into it.
And let's be clear, some of that critique was deserved. The first day exposed grave failures in planning, intelligence, artillery preparation, and tactical execution. But some of it hardened into caricature. The lions led by donkeys interpretation is emotionally powerful because it gives the horror a villain.
Yeah, that's right.
And to be clear, some senior commanders deserve criticism, of course. Everyone's human.
Yeah.
But Haig deserves criticism. Rawlinson deserves scrutiny. The staff system deserves scrutiny. The culture of optimism deserves scrutiny, but I'm not sure you'd want to do it in another way.
Yeah, that can-do attitude.
Yeah.
But if we reduce the Somme to, quote, stupid generals murdering brave men for nothing, unquote, we flatten the battle into nothing better than just a morality play.
Yeah.
And the real battle was not a morality play. It was a strategic necessity conducted with insufficient tools, imperfect doctrine, uneven leadership, industrial firepower on a massive scale, and human endurance stretched well beyond anything reasonable, which is much harder to put on a bumper sticker,
It sure is. I mean, Donald Rumsfeld in the Second Iraq War got a lot of shit for saying the quote, you don't go to war with the army you wish you had, you go to the war with the army you have. And he was, shat on for being so insensitive, but it's the reality. You got to do what you got.
Yeah.
The Somme ended in November 1916. The weather had deteriorated. Oof, had it ever.
Yes.
The ground had become a swamp. The offensive had failed to achieve the decisive breakthrough that Haig had hoped for, and the territorial gains were limited, about 7 miles or 11 kilometers at the deepest point.
Yeah, in purely operational terms, that sounds disastrous.
Right.
Newton, my contrarian cat, says...
He says it was disastrous.
Disastrous, yes. But strategically, the outcome is more complicated. The Somme relieved pressure on Verdun. It inflicted heavy losses on the German army. It forced Germany to reconsider how it defended the Western Front. It accelerated Allied tactical development. And it helped turn the British Army from a mass volunteer amateur army.
Yeah.
And that's key, into a more experienced instrument of continental warfare.
And it contributed to Germany's later decision to withdraw, to pull back their front lines to the Hindenburg Line in 1917, shortening its front and adopting deeper defensive systems. The Germans did not come away from the Somme thinking, well, that was fine, let's do that every summer.
No, indeed, because they suffered as well, quite badly. For the British and Empire forces, the Somme was both a trauma and a school. For the French, it was part of the desperate year of Verdun and survival. For the Germans, it was proof that the Allied armies could absorb punishment and keep coming. And for the Canadians, it was one of the brutal steps toward becoming one of the most effective formations on the Western Front and the beginning of the reputation that was to follow, I think.
Yes, and for historians, it remains one of the central battles of the First World War because it sits at the intersection of so many questions. Can attrition be strategy?
Yeah.
How do armies learn under fire? When does necessity become waste? Can tactical progress redeem operational failure? And how do you measure achievement when the currency is human life?
Yeah.
These are not easy questions, which is part of the reason why the Somme still matters.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
The danger in any Somme episode is that we get lost in corps, divisions, barrages, objectives, and casualty tables. So let's bring it back to the men. We'll go back to Rejoy's good buddy Al Bundy. Lieutenant Alfred Bundy's account of July 1st describes what it was like. Bundy says they went over at 7:30 a.m. after what felt like an endless wait under terrible apprehension. I can imagine they were nervous.
Yes.
As they advanced, the noise that you described was overwhelming. British artillery, German guns, shell bursts, dusts, choking fumes, smoke, and almost no visibility. And at first his platoon kept, moving in good order and hadn't taken many casualties. They reached roughly halfway across no man's land, and he could see no sign of life in the German front line. All right, things are looking good. But then suddenly, German rifle and machine gun fire opened up. His men began to fall. Bundy shouted for them to get down, but most of the survivors had already taken whatever cover they could find. He dropped into a shell hole and tried to move, but the fire was so heavy that even raising his head would have meant almost certain death. And he could no longer see his own men all around him. He could hear the wounded crying out. His account strips away any romance. There's no glory in it. There's discipline, fear, confusion, pain, and the terrible isolation of men trapped between lines.
I don't know if the AI will cancel out the noise suppression, but Newton, my contrarian cat, was just trying to add in a little bit of what might have been heard, the screaming and the yelling.
Yes.
To give a little bit more nuance,
background
feeling to your narrative there. There's also a grim aftermath noted in a catalog description of the battalion's diary. After dark, Bundy made it back to the British line, found his company commander in a shattered state, and took command of what remained of C Company. Reportedly only 30 men.
Starting to see a pattern here, Rejoy.
Yeah, the company reduced to basically a platoon. Jesus. The same description says the 2nd Middlesex Regiment suffered 22 officer casualties and around 600 other rank casualties that day. The Middlesex in particular, there's some good visual documentation of their attack, and but on the first day, if I recall correctly, you can actually find that online. Now, Robert Graves, who served with the Royal Welsh Fusiliers and was wounded on the Somme, later wrote in Goodbye to All That with the bitterness of someone who had seen the war's machinery from the inside. Graves' memoir is not neutral history,
No.
but it is essential emotional evidence, the voice of a man who survived and did not emerge grateful for the experience. I've read that. I've read his book, and it is it's very, very interesting.
Highly recommend it.
Yes.
Yeah. And you're right. He did not emerge grateful for the experience, but nor should he have.
No.
What men were being asked to do was unbelievable. Yeah. And for our beloved RMR, of course, the roll call after Courcelette gives us another kind of testimony. Not a literary passage, not a poem, just simple, cold arithmetic.
Yeah.
445 men started the battle. 75 answered when it ended. That's a sentence written by war in the shortest possible form. The Somme is difficult to talk about because it resists simplicity. It's not a victory in the clean sense, and that is what makes it so hard. The first day deserves its place in memory. It was catastrophic, but it should never be softened.
No.
The Somme was also another 141 days. It was 142 days of battle total.
Yeah.
It changed tactics. It damaged the German army. It shaped the British army. It helped create the conditions for later Allied effectiveness. The cost was obscene. The lessons were real. Both statements can be true at the same time.
Oh, very, very, very much so. I think Ludendorff also said they couldn't go to another battle of the Somme, the
No.
Germans, and also
No.
they came that close to breaking. And perhaps that is the honest way to remember the Somme.
Yeah.
Not as a noble sacrifice wrapped
No.
in bunting or as a cartoon of idiots and victims, but as a battle fought by men trapped inside the machinery of, well, the First Industrial War, commanded by officers trying and often failing to solve problems their institutions barely understood.
Right.
Against an enemy who was skilled, dug in, and equally determined. For the Canadians and for our beloved regiment, the Somme was not an abstraction. It was Courcelette, it was shellfire, it was counterattack, it was Kenora Trench, it was the roll call. And for the RMR, as for so many regiments, the Somme had become part of the inheritance. Not a glorious inheritance, but a hard one.
So 110 years on, we remember the Somme not because it gives us easy lessons, but because it denies us the easy lessons. And in military history, those are usually the ones worth keeping. So thanks for sticking with us, folks. This has been a relatively long episode here. So this is episode number 55. Thank you, Rejoy, for writing a banger of a script. This has been really well done. This has been the Rum Ration Podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, please do us a favor, share it, let people know about it, and hit like and subscribe. Hit that button. Hit it hard. And until next time, cheers to history.